Hi again, all. Hope you're doing all right. This is a continuation of my last video. So if you haven't checked that out yet, then I'd recommend doing so because uh, we've discussed what I'm going to read much more in depth over there. But to sum it up, we're to just give like a brief reintroduction, talking about the politics of virtue and virtue signaling, whatever this means anymore, because I've heard this word so many times that it's just pissed me off at this point. The term has come back to light in the context of both the lockdown and, in particular, the Black Lives Matter protest in response to the George Floyd incident, or rather murder, effectively. Third degree murder as it stands. The trial may change this. We do not know yet, but officially and legally, third degree murder by a police officer, Derek Chauvin. There has been a heated response, as we all know. And in particular, whenever a social justice event occurs, we see a lot of people starting to complain about virtue signalling. We discussed a bit about what these terms mean, both on the political left and the right, broadly speaking. And I'm referring it back to this book, Hannah Arendt, on revolution, which is quite timely and relevant, I think. So again, really brief recap on this. This is a cross-comparative analysis of the American and French Revolution. Hannah is a classical liberal and biased towards the American Revolution, more sympathetic. She has more faith in a focus on the political and civic question, so political representation in the public sphere, giving all people on land citizenship and therefore access to influence over politics, over government, accountability, the old no taxation without representation, etc. She's more sympathetic and believes this to be more effective than the social question. The issue being discussed is the way that the social question haunted 18th and 19th century Europe to a greater extent, at least in theory, that it did America, particularly for the leaders of the revolution. So, because of this, the politics of virtue were put in a more classical context for the American Revolution. They were a mixture of Platonic idealists with some religious ideas on virtue, but this being the Enlightenment, they were trying to separate from the old feudal religious cosmology and the authoritarianism of the church, which had arose from that. We saw the development of the philosophy of rationalism, which was connected to the scientific method, and the idea of the thinking individual and self-determination and grace, in a sense, grace in a atheistic sense, through reason, through induction, through a posteriori, I can't say that, a posteriori, which is basically learning, knowing through experience. Didn't talk about this in the last video. I'm not going to go too much into it because there's already a lot of stuff on rationalism. What's important is to consider, at least in Hannah's view, that Europe was more influenced by Romanticism than rationalism, even before we would typically associate the Romantic period. We would usually associate Romanticism as arising in the early to mid 19th century, kind of existing alongside classical liberalism and individualism, and also the rise of empiricism and the scientific method in a sense. And finally, with materialism and Marxism, things like that, which is jumping ahead of ourselves, really. But in her opinion, Romanticism was already prevalent in the mentalities of both the Enlightenment French philosophe of the Ancien Regime and also some, at least, of the leading figures of the revolution. We're going to be discussing here Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Maximilien Robespierre. Rousseau was a philosopher. He did not play a political part in the actual outcome of the revolution, of the actual practice, but he was very, very influential on liberal Enlightenment theory, but also on Romanticism, and therefore on the development of the thought leaders. Robespierre, by contrast, was not a thought leader, he was a political leader, and he was the leader of the radical faction, in fact, of the what was becoming of the French Republic shortly after the decline, the abolition of the absolutist monarchy in 1791. Robespierre led the Jacobin Revolution, also known as the White Terror, which was effectively a totalitarian party state. It was a dictatorship of sorts, and it was a bloody purge both of the inside political parties and also of the citizens for failing to fall on the party line of the Republic's concept of virtue. Therefore, it's quite often used as an example of the dangers of the totalitarian mindset. But what exactly is going on there? Because it's easy to say. Well, thankfully, Arendt has offered us a little glimpse of the possibilities. So, we're going to be discussing from extracts from pages 68 to 79. Again, disclaimer, this is not my work, this is the work of Hannah Arendt. She was writing back in the 60s, it was a long time ago, so I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a student of it, obviously. So not really original ideas, I'm just sharing parts, and yeah. Let's check where we're going. Okay. So what's going to be important here is the idea of virtue that was emerging from the merging, the hybrid of the rationalist and romanticist mind, which shaped the French revolutionary spirit, as it were, whereas the American Revolution, which should be discussed less, was much more focused on just the rationalist focus. So again, the political, the civic question, and trying to stick as much to science and reason and things as possible. From the leftist perspective, this could greatly explain why America has been much more focused on protection, preservation of private property and of individualism, of the idea of self-actualization through self-reliance in Walt Whitman, but again, jumping ahead to the thoughts of liberal American thinkers in the 19th century there. Things like Manifest Destiny, American exceptionalism, ultimately the American dream, which is discussed later in the book, but you get the idea. Romanticism was much more to do with the emotions, to do with the passions, the heart, the idea that you can't just have Cartesian dualism, so the mind-body connection, but you also have to consider the soul and consciousness, because this is what separates us even more from animals and from tyrants in particular, because that is what the philosopher trying to escape from. So that's what makes for a truly rational man and a citizen to a conscience. The dilemma is going to be about whether virtue should be focused in this empirical sense or it should be focused in this romantic sense. What is the issue with the romantic sense? For Arendt, it is sentimentalism and pity, which we quite often see in the context of things like performative allyship, of the savior complex of an ally to various progressive social justice groups, to radical groups, and of the idea of just general self-aggrandizement. So, pages 68 to 79, I believe. Not the whole thing, but let's go. As soon as I have had my little sip of my up here. Might be a little pause while I try and get my bearings on the next bit. Okay. The reader may have noted the curious equation of will and interest on which the whole body of Rousseau's political theory rests. He uses the terms synonymously throughout the social contract, and his silent assumption is that the will is some sort of automatic articulation of interest. Hence, the general will is the articulation of a general interest, the interest of the people or the nation as a whole. And because this interest or will is general, its very existence hinges on its being opposed to each interest or will in particular. In Rousseau's construction, the nation need not wait for an enemy to threaten its borders in order to rise like one man and to bring about the union sacrée. The oneness of the nation is guaranteed insofar as each citizen carries within himself the common enemy as well as the general interest which the common enemy brings into existence. For the common enemy is the particular interest of the particular will of each man. If only each particular man rises against himself in his particularity, he will be able to rouse in himself his own antagonist, the general will, and thus he will become a true citizen of the national body politic. For if one takes away from all particular wills the pluses and minuses that cancel one another, the general will remains the sum of the differences. To partake in the body politic of the nation, each national must rise and remain in constant rebellion against himself. To be sure, no national statesman has followed Rousseau to this logical extreme. And while the current nationalist concepts of citizenship depend to a very large extent upon the presence of a common enemy from abroad, we find nowhere the assumption that the common enemy resides in everybody's heart. It is different, however, with the revolutionists and the tradition of revolution. It was not only in the French Revolution, but in all revolutions which its example inspired, that the common interest appeared in the guise of common enemy. And the theory of terror, from Robespierre to Lenin and Stalin, presupposes that the interest of the whole must automatically and indeed permanently be hostile to the particular interest of the citizen. One has often been struck by the peculiar selflessness of the revolutionists, which should not be confused with idealism or heroism. Virtue has indeed been equated with selflessness ever since Robespierre preached a virtue that was borrowed from Rousseau, and it is the equation which has put, as it were, its indelible stamp upon the revolutionary man and his innermost conviction that the value of a policy may be gauged by the extent to which it will contradict all particular interests, and that the value of a man may be judged by the extent to which he acts against his own interest and against his own will. Whatever theoretically the explanations and consequences of Rousseau's teachings might be, the point of the matter is the actual experiences underlying Rousseau's selflessness and Robespierre's terror of virtue cannot be understood without taking into account the crucial role compassion had come to play in the minds and hearts of those who prepared and of those who acted in the course of the French Revolution. To Robespierre, it was obvious that the one force which could and must unite the different classes of society into one nation was the compassion of those who did not suffer with those who were malheureux, of the higher classes with the low people. The goodness of man in a state of nature had become axiomatic for Rousseau because he found compassion to be the most natural human reaction to the suffering of others, and therefore the very foundation of all authentic, natural human intercourse. Not that Rousseau, or Robespierre for that matter, had ever experienced the innate goodness of natural man outside society. They deduced his existence from the corruption of society, much as one who has intimate knowledge of rotten apples may account for their rottenness by assuming the original existence of healthy ones. What they knew from inner experience was the eternal play between reason and the passions on one side, the inner dialogue of thought in which man converses with himself on the other. And since they identified thought with reason, they concluded that reason interfered with passion and compassion alike, that it turns man's mind back upon itself and divides him from everything that could disturb or afflict him. Reason makes man selfish. It prevents nature from identifying itself with the unfortunate sufferer. Or, in the words of Saint-Just, il faut ramener toutes les définitions à la conscience. L'esprit est un sophiste qui conduit toutes les vertus à l'échafaud. Don't ask me exactly what that means, because there is no translation. Fun. We are so used to ascribing the rebellion against reason to the early romanticism of the 19th century and to understanding, in contrast, the 18th century in terms of an enlightened rationalism, with the Temple of Reason as its somewhat grotesque symbol, that we are likely to overlook or to underestimate the strength of these early pleas for passion, for the heart, for the soul, and especially for the soul torn into two, for Rousseau's Un déchiré. It is as though Rousseau, in his rebellion against reason, had put a soul torn into two, into the place of the two in one that manifests itself in the silent dialogue of the mind with itself, which we call thinking. And since the two in one of the soul is a conflict and not a dialogue, it engenders passion in its twofold sense of intense suffering and of intense passionateness. It was this capacity for suffering that Rousseau had pitted against the selfishness of society on one side, against the undisturbed solitude of the mind engaged in a dialogue with itself on the other. And it was to this emphasis on suffering, more than to any other part of his teachings, that he owed the enormous predominant influence over the minds of the men who were to make the revolution, and who found themselves confronted with the overwhelming sufferings of the poor, to whom they had opened the doors to the public realm and its light for the first time in history. What counted here in this great effort of a general human solidarization was selflessness, the capacity to lose oneself in the sufferings of others rather than active goodness, and what appeared most odious and even most dangerous was selfishness rather than wickedness. These men, moreover, were much better acquainted with vice than they were with evil. They had seen the vices of the rich in their incredible selfishness, and they concluded that virtue must be the appanage of misfortune and the patrimony of the poor. They had watched how the charms of pleasure were escorted by crime, and they argued that the torments of misery must engender goodness. The magic of compassion was that it opened the heart of the sufferer to the sufferings of others, whereby it established and confirmed the natural bond between men which only the rich had lost. Where passion, the capacity for suffering, and compassion, the capacity for suffering with others, ended, vice began. Selfishness was a kind of natural depravity. If Rousseau had introduced compassion into political theory, it was Robespierre who brought it onto the marketplace with the vehemence of his great revolutionary oratory. It was perhaps unavoidable that the problem of good and evil, of their impact upon the course of human destinies, in its stark, unsophisticated simplicity, should have haunted the minds of men at the very moment when they were asserting or reasserting human dignity without any resort to institutionalized religion. But the depth of this problem could hardly be sounded by those who mistook for goodness the natural, innate repugnance of man to see his fellow creatures suffer, Rousseau, and who thought that selfishness and hypocrisy were the epitome of wickedness. More importantly, even, the terrifying question of good and evil could not even be posed, at least not in the framework of Western traditions, without taking into account the only completely valid, completely convincing experience Western mankind had ever had with active love of goodness as the inspiring principle of all actions, that is, without consideration of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. What follows is a discussion of two books, one by Herman Melville of Moby Dick fame, and another by Fyodor Dostoevsky, that's famous Russian author, Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, never say it, The Idiot, quite a few others. I absolutely loved Crime and Punishment, by the way. I did read Moby Dick, and I even did a public reading of one chapter, but yeah, it goes on a bit about the whale and that, it's interesting, I guess, but wasn't for me. Anyway, they're discussing this because they are both very good at discussing human nature and particularly in a Judeo-Christian context. The books they bring up are The Grand Inquisitor and Billy Budd. So I was given a little bit of this. So let me get my notes again. Okay, now we're up to page 75. Just let me check. Like 10 past 12, it's getting a bit late, but it's all right because I love you. Compassion, by its very nature, cannot be touched off by the sufferings of a whole class or a people, or, least of all, mankind as a whole. It cannot reach out farther than what is suffered by one person and still remain what it is supposed to be, co-suffering. Its strength hinges on the strength of passion itself, which, in contrast to reason, can comprehend only the particular has no notion of the general and no capacity for generalization. The sin of the Grand Inquisitor was that he, like Robespierre, was attracted toward Léon Faible, not only because such attraction was indistinguishable from lust for power, but also because he had depersonalized the sufferers, lumped them together into an aggregate, the people toujours malheureux, the suffering masses, etc. Sorry. pausing while I check. Yeah, I was just about to go into a bit too much detail on the Grand Inquisitor there, but again, need to summarize the basic stories going on here are one of a young man who gets chased by some older man who, for whatever reason, wants to kill him, and it's symbolic of kind of innocence versus sin of maturity of experience, not touched by the world. Theological implications of naked man. The boy represents naked man in his innocence. We've got the same thing going on in the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, which is basically Jesus at a trial. Quite an interesting text. But yeah. So, because compassion abolishes the distance, the worldly space between men where political matters, the whole realm of human affairs are located, it remains, politically speaking, irrelevant and without consequence. In the words of Melville, it is incapable of establishing lasting institutions. Jesus' silence in the Grand Inquisitor and Billy Budd's stammer indicate the same, namely their incapacity or unwillingness for all kinds of predicative or argumentative speech, in which someone talks to somebody about something that is of interest to both because its interest it is between them. Such talkative and argumentative interest in the world is entirely alien to compassion, which is directed solely and with passionate intensity towards suffering man himself. Compassion speaks only to the extent that it has to reply directly to the sheer expressionist sound and gestures through which suffering becomes audible and visible in the world. As a rule, it is not compassion which sets out to change worldly conditions in order to cease human suffering. It says case, I think that's a typo. But if it does, it will shun the drawn-out, wearisome processes of persuasion, negotiation, and compromise, which are the processes of law and politics, and lend its voice to the suffering itself, which must claim for swift and direct action, that is, for action with the means of violence. Here again, the relatedness of the phenomena of goodness and compassion is manifest. For goodness that is beyond virtue and hence beyond temptation, ignorance of the argumentative reasoning by which man fends off temptations and, by this very process, comes to know the ways of wickedness, is also incapable of learning the arts of persuading and arguing. The great maxim of all civilized legal systems, that the burden of proof must always rest with the accuser, sprang from the insight that only guilt can be irrefutably proved. Innocence, on the contrary, to the extent it is more than not guilty, cannot be proved but must be accepted on faith, whereby the trouble is that this faith cannot be supported by the given word, which can be a lie. Billy Budd could have spoken with the tongues of angels, and yet would not have been able to refute the accusations of the elemental evil that confronted him. He could only raise his hand and strike the accuser dead. Clearly, Melvin reversed the primordial legendary crime. Cain slew Abel, which has played such an enormous role in our tradition of political thought. But this reversal was not arbitrary. It followed from the reversal the men of the French Revolution had made of the proposition of original sin, which they had replaced by the proposition of original goodness. Melville states the guiding question of his story himself in the preface. How is it possible that after the rectification of the old world's hereditary wrongs, straight away the revolution itself became a wrongdoer, one more oppressive than the king's? He found the answer, surprisingly enough, if one considers the common equations of goodness with meekness and weakness, in that goodness is strong, stronger perhaps even than wickedness, but that it shares with elemental evil the elementary violence inherent in all strength and detrimental to all forms of political organization. It is as though he said, let us suppose that from now on the foundation stone of our political life will be that Abel slew Cain. Don't you see that from this deed of violence the same chain of wrongdoing will follow? Only that now mankind will not even have the consolation that the violence it must call crime is indeed characteristic of evil men only. Moving into chapter 4 to finish, well, not chapter 4, part 4 of chapter 2. This is a bloody long chapter, but whatever. Page 78 to 9. My drink. Glug glug. It is more than doubtful that Rousseau discovered compassion out of suffering with others, and it is more than probable that in this, as in nearly all other respects, he was guided by his rebellion against high society, especially against its glaring indifference, speech impediment there, towards the suffering of those who surrounded it. He had summoned up the resources of the heart against the indifference of the salon and against the heartlessness of reason, both of which will say, at the sight of the misfortunes of others, perish if you wish, I am secure. Yet, while the plight of others aroused his heart, he became involved in his heart rather than in the sufferings of others, and he was enchanted with its moods and caprices as they disclosed themselves in the sweet delight of intimacy which Rousseau was one of the first to discover, and which from then on began playing its important role in the formation of modern sensibility. In this sphere of intimacy, compassion became talkative, as it were, since it came to serve, together with the passions and with suffering, as stimulus for the vitality of the newly discovered range of emotions. Compassion, in other words, was discovered and understood as an emotion or a sentiment, and the sentiment which corresponds to the passion of compassion is, of course, pity. Pity may be the perversion of compassion, but its alternative is solidarity. It is out of pity that men are attracted towards les amphibles. No. But it is out of solidarity that they establish themselves, that they establish deliberately and, as it were, dispassionately a community of interest with the oppressed and exploited. The common interest would then be the grandeur of man, or the honour of the human race, or the dignity of man. For solidarity, because it partakes of reason and hence of generality, is able to comprehend the multitude conceptually, not only the multitude of a class or a nation or a people, but eventually all mankind. But this solidarity, though it may be aroused by suffering, is not guided by it, and it comprehends the strong and the rich no less than the weak and the poor. Compared with the sentiment of pity, it may appear cold and abstract, for it remains committed to ideas, to greatness or honour or dignity, rather than to any love of men. Pity, because it is not stricken in the flesh and keeps its sentimental distance, can succeed where compassion always will fail. It can reach out to the multitude and therefore, like solidarity, enter the marketplace. But pity, in contrast to solidarity, does not look upon both fortune and misfortune, the strong and the weak, with an equal eye. Without the presence of misfortune, pity could not exist, and it therefore has just as much vested interest in the existence of the unhappy as thirst for power has a vested interest in the existence of the weak. Moreover, by virtue of being a sentiment, pity can be enjoyed for its own sake, and this will almost automatically lead to a glorification of its cause, which is the suffering of others. Terminologically speaking, solidarity is a principle that can inspire and guide action. Compassion is one of the passions, and pity is a sentiment. Robespierre's glorification of the poor, at any rate, his praise of suffering as the spring of virtue, was sentimental in the strict sense of the word, and as such, dangerous enough, even if they were not, as we are inclined to suspect, a mere pretext for lust for power. Okay, so some food for thought there about the politics of virtue, compassion, sentimentalism, and pity. I'd like to hear what you think about this, and if it does relate to anything that we are seeing psychologically speaking, on both sides of the political compass right now. And one of the questions which has quite interested me, which was discussed in another section I couldn't read because it's too much, was whether good intention is necessary for good action. There is a spectrum of thought on this, really. One is that purity of intention must always be required, and on the other, that it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter just how much you're self-interested, but you if you do something good, if you've done a good deed, then that's it. Because what you're thinking, what you're feeling, it doesn't mean shit. And that's actually the legal standard, really, for a lot of things. Mens rea, the mentality of the person committing the crime, matters less than the actus reus, the actual crime being done. Although for more severe offences, it needs to be proven that there was an intention, that there was a mentality in place. But we're not just talking about the law here, we're talking about culture in general. And I've found that some of the arguments against virtue signalling being the idea, well, he could be a hypocrite, he could be self-interested, they could, she could, we could be doing this for our own personal gain, to be mostly kind of disingenuous and just trying to get in the way of virtuous actions, as it were. There's also a broader argument that really is helping one group going to harm another, which is going to really explode things and probably lead to a lot of like reactionary whataboutery and shit, which too much, but it's inevitable. We've all been stuck in those mires, or maybe you've participated in them. As do in that case. I've said what I've said. Anyway, Locke, Rousseau, Robespierre, rationalism, romanticism, individualism, the social question, which would become collectivism, materialism, Marxism. Not always Marxism, anarchism and libertarian socialism were other forms, but like, particularly in America, most people only really seem to think of the left as just communism, and it's not. But anyway, the point is that this is where the divide happens, the French-American Revolution. That's very interesting, I think, and it could explain a large part of the European-American divide. But yeah, keep rambling. Politics of virtue. Give me your thoughts. I hope that I'll be able to come back with more extracts, probably of a different book, because I don't want to get sued for copyright fraud for just reading a full book, when otherwise we'd need to like audible it or something, but whatever. Anyway, I've enjoyed it. I hope that you found it useful. Please keep safe, stay well. I shall see you soon. Adios.